Studies 9. How's it going today? We're going to keep plugging away at Chapter 3, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and how that affects your individual rights. Specifically today, we're going to delve into a little bit of the history of Canada and how that has affected the Charter that you know and love so much today. I'm going to be going through a lot today. Like I said, I always try and keep these videos under 7 minutes. I don't know if I'm going to be successful today, but I'm going to be cranking through a lot of information, so please try and keep up. Pause as you need to. Again, same as last day, make sure you have my video, this half, your notes, this half, book in front of you. Let's go. So, that's where we finished last day. So today we're going to be talking about what does the Charter reflect about today's society compared to the past. So we're going to be looking at some events from Canadians' history. As we explore them, think about how the government's actions affected those individual rights. How does the Charter that we have today protect those rights? Okay, so as we go through, you're going to see a lot of people's rights that you know so well today were violated in Canada's past, right? And that has helped form the Charter that we have today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about First Nations group. We don't need to go into a whole lot of detail about, we all know that, they haven't been treated well in Canada here in the history, and we're doing everything we can to try and make it better. Really good example of how the mistreatment of the Indian First Nations, I should say, happened in Canada was something called the Indian Act, and that was passed in 1876. So it was passed without any consultation with First Nations people, and this in 1876, people that were in charge of Canada, if you want to put it that way, were of European descent, and they viewed European ways as superior and European people as superior to those of First Nations. So the Indian Act did a lot of different things. So at certain points in the history of the Indian Act, it required First Nations people to obtain government permission to wear traditional clothing. Think about that for a second, right? Think about like something that you like to wear. Imagine if you had to get permission from the government to wear it, okay? It banned traditional ceremonies. Again, like let's say, for example, the government comes out tomorrow and says Christmas is illegal. Right? Well, that's essentially what they did to First Nations peoples. Traditional First Nation ceremonies were banned. First Nations were banned and prevented from taking part of any political action. Couldn't vote, couldn't protest, couldn't do anything, and they were forced to live on reserves, which we know are still around today. Next example we're going to talk about is Canadian women and the right to vote. So until 1918, women were not allowed to vote or run as candidates in Canada. This was obviously very different today. I mean, you look around, we've got tons of women in power, and not only in political, but we have in the COVID crisis, I think it's like 8 of the 12 chief medical officers are female. It's awesome. Canadian women began campaigning in 1876 for the right to vote, and this was led by Canada's first female doctor, Emily Howard Stowe. The idea that women should be able to vote was so radical at the time that women's groups had to hide that they were meeting. So there's a famous one called the Toronto Women's Literary Club. So that's what they called it. Essentially, but they called it a book club. But what it was is they would meet and discuss what could they do to try and get the vote, to try and make women seen as equal to men. And some other famous women that you should know. The first one's Nellie McClung. She's a famous Canadian feminist who's instrumental in women's rights movement. And again, you'll see there's a little click there, Historica Minute. It's a really good video. It's one of those Canadian, you've probably seen it on TV. Click on that, give that a minute of your time, learn a little bit about her. Obviously very important, so make sure you pause that and look at that. I'll wait for you. Welcome back. Okay, next one we're going to talk about is Emily Murphy. Again, another famous Canadian female. She fought to have women recognized as persons by the British and Canadian government. Okay, so think about that for a second. Under law, women in Canada weren't seen as people under Canadian and British law. Now again, there's a great Historica Minute there. Pause me, have a look at that. Welcome back. Let's keep going. Next thing we're going to talk about is the internment of Ukrainian Canadians. Okay, so again, think about this. Your charter, there's no charter. There's nothing to protect your individual rights. The government has power. So at the beginning of World War I in 1914, more than 8,000 people of Ukrainian and German descent who were living in Canada were arrested and sent to camps because of their identity. Again, we talked about the War Measures Act, right, earlier, a couple days ago. So the Canadian government passed the War Measures Act, which gave them the power to move people as they saw fit. So whether they send them to a camp, whether they send them across seas to fight, whatever it is, the government could do whatever they wanted to do. Canada and its allies were at war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, right? So they saw anyone that is in Canada that might have been German descent or of Ukrainian descent, they saw them as enemies. So they moved them into camps. The people interned had to work as laborers. They built roads. They worked in national parks, but they received no wages. They were prisoners in their own country. In 2005, Canada's Parliament passed the Internment of Persons of Ukrainian Origin Recognition Act, which acknowledges this event in Canadian history. It's great to acknowledge it. It's the first step to healing. Obviously, it's a terrible thing. Same thing happened with Italian Canadians. During World War II, Canada used the War Measures Act again to arrest people of Italian descent and send them to camps, because again, we were at war with Germany and Italy. Entire families were forced into camps and their properties were seized and not given back. Keep that in mind. Like, you're a family of Italian descent, you've been here for however long, you've got a business, you've got a house, you've got property, government takes it. You don't get it back. In 1990, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney apologized to the Italian community for the internment. Last time I checked, again, as I've talked at the beginning, it's been 6 years since I taught this course, but members of the Italian community were still seeking compensation. I had not heard if anything was ever given from that. Here's hoping. And the last internment we're going to talk about is the internment of Japanese Canadians. This was the worst one, and you hear about this one a lot. And it's pretty simple as to why this was the worst one. To put it bluntly, you could visibly notice Japanese Canadians, right? If you're a Ukrainian Canadian, you were born and raised here, or you've been here for 30 years, or Italian Canadian, you can hide it, right? You might not have it. You might have a little bit of an accent, but you can hide that accent. But if I look at you visibly, it's hard to tell you apart from people of other European descent. Japanese Canadians didn't have that same opportunity. You could visibly see that they were of Japanese or Chinese descent, right? So on December 7th, 1941, during World War II was already happening at this point, but the Americans were not in the war. But Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and that essentially brought the USA into World War II. Now what happened then is any Canadians and Americans with Japanese ancestry suddenly found themselves treated with suspicion and hatred, even though a lot of them had been born and raised in Canada. So in February 1942, Canada's government decided to move all peoples of Japanese origins away from the West Coast. Still today, but even in 1942, the West Coast had a very large Japanese population. It's just the closest to Japan, right? It's for other reason. That's just where they come off, and that's where they live, right? It's the closest to Japan. So under the War Measures Act, which was again enacted, more than 200,000 men, women, and children were forced to leave their communities. They were moved inland in BC, loaded in trains, and moved inland into camps. Japanese people's possessions and homes were confiscated, and they were sent to work camps in the BC interior. These people were treated like enemies and hated, even though they had been born and raised in Canada. A really great example, he's still around today, is a guy by the name of George Takei. He was famous for being one of the pilot on the original Star Trek. And he's kind of reemerged in the last 20 years as having really big Twitter and Facebook following. He is a homosexual man of Japanese descent. He lived in these internment camps. American, obviously, he wasn't Canadian, but if you click on that link there, he kind of tells his story, and it's fantastic. It's amazing. So just kind of give that a go, watch that, and then come back. But essentially, like, relative to the Japanese Canadians, in turn received $21,000 as kind of reparation payment in 2007. So that's where we're gonna finish today. Just a real quick history on Canada and why we have the charter we have today. What things have kind of helped form it, whether it be internment camps and women's rights and all those things. So there's lots of little videos in there. So please make sure you watch them. Like I said, I really tried to give just the Coles notes of this. but it's really important, I think, that you know what's happened in your country to form the country that you have today. That's it for today. Hope you guys followed along. Again, if you have any questions, pop them on the Google Classroom, send me an email. Have a good one, guys. Peace.